All right, so before I kick it off, I just wanted to say thank you to Devin for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Not only does it allow me to disseminate information that I find important, but in the process of preparing for the talk, it also kind of sharpens my understanding of all of this. And then just to echo what was already said, big thanks to Techlahoma for allowing events like this to happen. A couple things that were really important to me is they put on a couple job fairs each year. It's actually where I got my current job, and then I volunteered at a couple of the workshops, so one for Django, one for Rails. It's really important. It helps provide people an opportunity to see what software development looks like when they may not have it. And the only reason that happens is because of donors and volunteers. So if you're benefiting, enjoying what Techlahoma provides, please contribute in some way. A lot of the volunteering can actually be done from home. There's things you can do online, like editing videos or updating documentation, so you don't even have to leave home. Okay, so just a quick introduction about me. I work for a company called Legal Shield. I'm a software engineer there. They're an Oklahoma-based company. Main office is out of Ada, and actually born in Oklahoma as well. And I guess the best way to describe it is we sell legal insurance. So I primarily work with Angular there. And then probably the only other thing that's really important or relevant to this talk is that I got a degree in philosophy from OU. So that's kind of unique, and it's going to kind of come into play here. So what we're here to talk about is a book called The Pragmatic Programmer. How many of you have read it? Okay. If you Google it online, all kinds of websites will hype it up, saying it's in the top 10 list of most popular or most important programming books. The actual full title is The Pragmatic Programmer, from Journeyman to Master. It was written by two gentlemen, Andrew Hunt and David Thomas, and it was first released in 1999. And I feel like I'm kind of doing you all an injustice because I didn't even notice until my friend Kimberly pointed it out, after I'd already started doing this, that they released a 20th anniversary edition, updated in May. And so I kind of Googled around, and they say that 1/3 of the book is new content. So it might be worth picking up. When I feel like reading it again, I'll probably grab it myself. It definitely needed some updating. It's kind of funny. They kind of give you steps to improve yourself and things to look at, and some of the programming languages they recommended that you look into didn't quite make it. So I hope they kind of updated some of those. But for those of you that haven't read it, just kind of a broad brushstroke summary of what the book is about. The whole purpose is to get us writing better code, and it's part technical. So they're going to cover development strategies, team organization, concepts like orthogonality and the law of Demeter, so very technical topics like that. And the other part is philosophical. So the first chapter is actually called The Pragmatic Philosophy. And what it looks at is what a flourishing programmer looks like. So what qualities does an individual that writes excellent code have? And in kind of reading about it and preparing, I saw a comment on Goodreads that I thought was pretty apt. It called it the self-help book for programmers. And I think they kind of come to that because they use a lot of metaphors. They kind of belabor the analogy of the programmer to the craftsman. And they do a pretty neat thing. They provide 70 tips throughout the book. The tips, you can read them online. They're just short one-liners, usually like 5 or 6 words. And it's just a great way that after you've read all this content, they kind of condense everything they've said down, both technical and philosophical, into these 70 bullet points. So it's really nice to just be able to kind of reflect on those. For this particular talk, we're going to be putting aside the technical aspects and focusing on the philosophical, specifically on the qualities that an excellent programmer kind of curates within themselves over time. And so my motivation for this talk is number one, because I have a degree in philosophy, so I'm naturally inclined to this, but particularly because I have an interest in the mental lives of the uniquely skilled. So I think an accessible analogy is like a quarterback, like the really, really good ones. What's the mental state that they maintain on the field? These are probably mental habits. Over time they've developed an ability to push out certain things, to bring in certain things, orders of operations of their mental habits that they've developed over time on and off the field. And I find that really interesting because it's a significant part of what makes people uniquely skilled. And so what I found interesting when I picked up this book is that the authors claimed that they had this, that they were able to kind of distill down the qualities that a uniquely skilled programmer would have. And so I found that really interesting. Just real quick, what we're going to cover and what we're not going to cover. I'm just, again, going to focus on the philosophical aspects. I'm going to exclude my opinion on anything. They provide, so we're going to be touching on like bad habits and good habits. They provide a lot of solutions. That's why it's called the Pragmatic Programmer, because they aren't just theorizing about things. They also provide concrete steps to proceed forward. I'm going to touch on them. That's a whole talk in itself if we kind of delved in there. So it's more to motivate you to go out and read the book yourself and kind of see their solutions. So I tried my best to break down this book, and I came up with kind of 3 broad topics we're going to cover. Three qualities that a pragmatic programmer has. So first of all, it is sober introspection. Second, it is understanding of our responsibility to others. And number 3 is the proper mental disposition. So the first 2 are going to be fairly quick, and the third one's going to be the meat of the topics. Nothing I'm going to talk about here is going to be groundbreaking or new. The issue isn't comprehension, right? These are topics you can just kind of nod along to. They make sense as you hear them. The difficult part is actually putting these into practice, and that's why we see so few uniquely skilled individuals, is because it's very difficult. So let's jump right into it. So first of all, we're going to take a look at sober introspection. And so they kind of put forth this idea that we should be soberly aware of our skill and ability. And so it's being aware of our knowledge in relation to the field that we're in, right? So we may not know everything in the field, but we at least have an awareness of the ends of that field, right? How big a piece of the knowledge pie have we cut off for ourselves so far? There's also the need to be soberly aware of how you are relative to others, to your peers. They actually mention, one tip they give is getting close to gurus. So the importance of being able to recognize people that are better than yourself, and that requires a very sober opinion of your ability. They also talk about our fallibility quite a bit throughout the entire book. So our failure to estimate appropriately, our tendency to forget the big picture and focus on the little details, to procrastinate, to get overwhelmed by product requirements and things like that. And so what they propose to help us develop this sober introspection is, number 1, to take time to reflect. You'll constantly see this throughout the book, that they're asking you to pause in the middle of something and look at your actions, at your mental state, and kind of evaluate where you're at right now. Also, to be malleable, be willing to change your opinions when new data presents itself. Learn about yourself. So if you tend to encounter paralysis when you feel overwhelmed, learn those habits about yourself and learn how to counter them. And they also, I thought this was really, really good, they talk about an investment portfolio. So you're actually investing in yourself. They provide concrete steps like learning a new language every year or reading a certain book every month. So that's worth reading in itself right there. So sober introspection, just a realistic understanding of your own skills and abilities relative to your surroundings. Next up is the responsibility to others. It's important to understand that we don't work in isolation, and like it's important to understand your own skills and abilities, it's also important that you reflect on what type of team member you are, so how you present yourself to other people. So are you overlapping other people's responsibilities? Are you communicating well? And it's really important to do this across kind of the broad plane of the people we interact with. So the obvious ones are our peers, our fellow engineers, but also management, product, and then I think an often forgotten one is it's important to understand our responsibility to the users that are going to be using our apps. the next one is, and they drive this one home big time, is honesty and the idea of taking responsibility. And not only that, but expecting other people to hold you accountable. So it's not just you opening yourself up for criticism, but it's also expecting other people to be doing that to you. And that when you do make a mistake, they provide tip number 3 in the book, so fairly early on, is to provide options and not make excuses. So it's not just, I did this, but a step further, here's what we do instead. And they talk about it's really important to take the time to do that. And then to have an appropriate response when somebody else makes a mistake. Tip 24 says, fix the code, not the blame. I think it's easy to forget that we're here to solve programming problems. We're not here to gossip or anything like that. We're all here together solving difficult problems. And so let's focus on the engineering that needs to get done. And so a couple concrete steps that they mention. Tip number 5 says, be a catalyst for change, right? So we should be the ones that kind of step up and push for culture changes, for technology changes, whatever it may be. And one suggestion they provide, this is a direct quote, it says, people find it easier to join an ongoing success. Show them a glimpse of the future and you'll get them to rally around. And a lot of this has to do with communication. It's how you present ideas. And so it's interesting, beyond the, I guess when I started reading the book, I expected most of it to be technical, but they spent quite a bit on soft skills like communication, and they have this acronym called WISDOM that helps you learn how to develop good questions to ask to kind of get the conversation flowing. And then one of my favorite tips from the book is the last one, the 70th one, that says, sign your work. So good old Git blame, making us all aware that other people will be using and reading our code 20 years into the future and cursing us by our own names, right? Okay, so that gets the first 2 out of the way. The next big one is the mental disposition. And I broke this down into 6 parts. I tried to come up with a decent little acronym, and I gave up after a brief try. I found one that had just enough vowels to be sensible, Tabarisi, just dumb enough to stick in your head. So first up, the T is think. Tip 2 actually says think, to think about what you're doing as you're doing it. It's really easy to just program by coincidence, which is actually tip number 44, to get stuck on autopilot, especially if it's an implementation you're familiar with or something you've done lots of times. It's easy to just start hitting keys and moving on. But they kind of show the difference between programming by coincidence and programming deliberately, and they talk about being focused in and being aware of what you do as you do it. They also talk about our tendency to make assumptions and how that creates consequences. So they actually say that when you're approaching a problem, we should try to recognize the assumptions that we have about the project and actually write them down. Another great tactic to expose assumptions is, of course, rubber ducking, that I think most people are familiar with, and they bring up a few times. And then after we recognize our assumptions, stop. Take your assumptions and prove it. One of the tips is don't assume, prove. And so if you find yourself assuming something, let's write a test for it and take care of it. And then tip 55 says don't think outside the box, find the box. I think a lot of times we can get stuck on writing clever solutions when we haven't exactly explored the boundaries, the limits, and the requirements of the problem we're trying to solve. Number 2 is act. So it's important to evaluate our productivity. What they talk about is developing a strategy of efficiency that enables us to be productive. And one of the big things they talk about is being able to recognize good tools and master them. So being able to, as you're preparing for a project, as you're architecting, looking around for tools that are readily available. It could be, personally it could be a text editor, but it could also be testing software or some type of module or library or something like that. These good tools, and being able to bring them in to increase productivity and master them. And they kind of give a metric of how many keystrokes per valuable output. So I think that's kind of interesting. I don't think we should be counting keystrokes, but I think the point is well made. Next up is balance. So one thing they talk about was between the first two, the think and the act, it can be really easy to get stuck in the thinking point. I mentioned paralysis early. Sometimes when you get overwhelmed, it's real easy to just kind of pick at the outsides of a problem. But you have to know when you've spent enough time thinking, so time box all of that planning, and when it's time to act. There's also this concept of good enough software, right? It would be great if we could all, well, some of us would really like it if we could just spend all of our time refactoring and honing and sharpening, but that's not responsible. And so I thought this was a really good quote that kind of summarized the importance of balance. They say, it would be unprofessional to polish the code one more time. It's equally unprofessional to promise unreasonable timescales and to cut basic engineering corners to meet a deadline. So it's all about balancing thinking and action. They also talk about the importance of remembering the big picture. Things change rapidly. We should expect them. Product requirements change on a dime. Product come back and say that we need this entire thing scrapped and changed, and this should come as no surprise to you because, as they say, there's no such thing as final decisions. And I think if who you work for practices agile, I think this should be familiar in the concept of crashing early. So things change as parameters change. As we discover that our plans fail, we should be able to react quickly. And tip 25, which I liked because I think it's actually the first entry in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the actual book that they use in the book, is tip 25 is don't panic. So it's maintain this calm demeanor, which comes about from expecting changes and being able to roll with the punches. So second to last, 5 is care. This one's really important to me. The first tip in the entire book, which shows, I think, how important it is to the authors, is to care about your craft. So it's kind of like I mentioned earlier, signing your name, right? It's an appreciation for the people that you work with, for the people that are going to be using your software. And it's really difficult to write good software if you just don't care. And along the same line, I like this idea. One of the tips is don't live with broken windows. So it's this idea of in a town, like an urban area, one window gets broken, and if it never gets fixed, what it does is starts creating an attitude of decay. And it's really easy for the second window to not get fixed, and the third, and the next thing you know, you have this slippery slope. And it's the same thing with code. It's the idea that you should address things as they come up before they start influencing the things around them. And the last portion of this is iterate, and it's enough to just quote what they say. So this is a direct quote. This whole process, this mental disposition, isn't a one-time audit of current practices. It's an ongoing critical appraisal of every decision you make every day and on every development. So it's this idea of paying attention to what you're doing, but also taking the time to iteratively reflect on your performance as a whole. And I think that's probably the key to this whole thing, is being able to step back and look at your performance. They're very data-driven, so they would probably like this to be on a schedule. So if like once a month you just took time to reflect on your performance, about your thought processes, and whether you're on autopilot, and then maybe setting up concrete steps to counteract that. So just to wrap this up, we're coming to the home stretch. The 3 things that I believe the authors proffer as qualities that every flourishing or uniquely skilled programmer has. Number 1, a sober estimation of ourself, our skills, and our abilities. Number 2, an understanding of the importance of our relationships. And number 3, a relentless attitude of self-improvement. And of course, what's kind of sits over this, it's important, is having the fortitude to make it all happen. And my absolute favorite quote from the book, I think, does an excellent job summing this up. And I actually looked for it online, and I couldn't find the original source. It might say it in the book. So it goes, a tourist visiting England's Eton College asked the gardener how he got the lawn so perfect. "That's easy," he replied. "You just brush off the dew every morning, mow them every other day, and roll them once a week." "Is that all?" asked the tourist. "Absolutely," replied the gardener. "Do that for 500 years and you'll have a nice lawn too." All right. Does anybody have any questions about anything? All right, perfect. Thanks everybody for having me.